Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe. For years, Margaret performed for audiences worldwide. Little did she know her most captivating role was the one she didn't consent to. Margaret Ellison had always embraced the spotlight. In her youth, the stage was her realm, a place where passion and art intertwined to create moments of magic. Now, in her late 50s, she resided in a quiet, secluded countryside home, far removed from the frenetic pace of a Hollywood. The house, with its creaking floorboards and overgrown garden, was both a sanctuary and a memoir of her past, a life filled with applause and adoration. Yet, as the days shortened and the nights lengthened, a persistent feeling of unease began to creep into her daily routine. It started subtly. A misplaced photograph on a mantel, a curtain drawn a little too perfectly in the morning light, and a faint hum of static that sometimes filled the silence of her living room. At first, Margaret dismissed these occurrences as the quirks of an aging home, and her own weariness from years under the spotlight. But the sensation of being observed never quite left her, even in moments of solitary reflection. The shadows in her home began to hold more than the usual shapes of dusk, and every whispered draft through the corridors felt like an invitation to an audience unseen. One chilly autumn evening, while Margaret was preparing a cup of tea in her cramped yet charming kitchen, she noticed something odd. There, hidden among the dense shadows cast by the flickering light of a single bulb, was the unmistakable glint of a small lens. Her heart pounded as she squinted, trying to make sense of the incongruity. Had someone, some entity, placed a device in her home? The thought was as implausible as it was terrifying. Yet the evidence lay stark before her. An innocuous-looking, dark, almost metallic object, embedded in the wood paneling near the window. For several days, Margaret wrestled with her thoughts. Her mind, accustomed to the rapid-fire lines of dialogue and the immersive illusions of stagecraft, now grappled with the reality of her situation. Paranoia and curiosity danced a macabre waltz within her. Each night, as the house settled into silence, she would hear a faint tapping at the window, a soft sound reminiscent of applause that was far too calculated to be mere coincidence. It was as if an unseen audience was applauding her every move, a performance for which she had never rehearsed. Unable to shake the growing dread, Margaret began her own quiet investigation. Her days, once filled with the comforting routine of gardening and long walks along the country lanes, were now punctuated by secretive searches of every nook and cranny of her home. She methodically examined rooms, closets, and even the attic, her trained eyes scanning for anomalies. The eerie discovery in the kitchen became the catalyst for a downward spiral into obsessive vigilance. At times, she found herself double-checking locks and peering out of darkened windows, half expecting to see figures lurking in the distance. Late one night, as a storm raged outside, Margaret sat at her dining table with a cup of now lukewarm tea, staring at her reflection in a window. The sound of rain pelting the glass was the only company she had as she mulled over the possibility that she was being watched. Not for admiration, but for something far more sinister. Her thoughts wandered back to her days on stage, when the idea of an audience both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Back then, every performance was a dialogue between her and the collective gaze of strangers. Now, that gaze was unnerving because it was uninvited, unyielding, and most importantly, unexplainable. One morning, determined to uncover the truth, Margaret contacted an old friend from the theater days, a retired technician named Samuel who had once rigged sound systems for large productions. Samuel, a man of few words and even fewer expressions, agreed to help, albeit with a reluctant air of uncertainty. When he arrived at her modest home, his eyes immediately took in the peculiar setup. With careful, measured movements, he began inspecting the rooms with an array of tools and devices that seemed more suited to a spy thriller than a country house. "Margaret," he said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone, "these aren't just random placements. Whoever is behind this knows what they're doing. There's a pattern here, a methodical, almost ritualistic precision." His words reverberated in her mind long after he left. That evening, while the wind howled like an unseen choir outside, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, enveloped by the soft glow of a single lamp. She recalled Samuel's parting words, each syllable laced with a foreboding certainty. The very notion that someone could orchestrate this level of surveillance in her sanctuary unsettled her to her core. It wasn't just a breach of privacy. It was an intrusion into the deepest recesses of her identity. In her long career, she had bared her soul on stage, but never had she imagined that the same vulnerability could be exploited in her private life. Days turned into weeks, and the presence in her home became a constant, insidious companion. Every night, as she tried to sleep, Margaret's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. A part of her, the seasoned performer, sought to find the thrill in this unanticipated plot twist, a final act that would redefine her narrative. Yet another part, the private self, trembled at the loss of control over her own life. Shadows moved in her peripheral vision, and the sound of muted claps seemed to echo in the hallways. The tension grew as she pieced together oddities. A forgotten timestamp on a digital clock that reset itself inexplicably. Recordings of soft whispers playing on a loop when she wasn't home, and the increasingly frequent, deliberate reappearance of that ominous camera lens in places where she thought she had removed it. One particularly harrowing evening, as Margaret sat by the window watching the rain, she noticed something new. A series of handwritten notes, small and inconspicuous, began to appear on her doorstep. Each note was meticulously penned in an elegant script that felt hauntingly familiar. The messages were ambiguous, filled with philosophical musings about the nature of performance, perception, and the price of authenticity. One note read, "Every life is a stage, and you are my final act." The words sent shivers down her spine, stirring memories of a past life where art and reality blurred into an indistinguishable haze. Unable to contain her mounting anxiety, Margaret resolved to confront this unseen force directly. In the solitude of her study, she set up an array of makeshift traps, simple recording devices, strategically placed mirrors, and even a series of old cameras that she had once owned for nostalgic reasons. She intended to catch her voyeur in the act, to unravel the mystery of who or what had become her relentless audience. Yet, as she meticulously arranged her instruments, an unspoken realization gnawed at her. The true horror was not in the act of being watched, but in the profound sense of vulnerability it evoked. The feeling that her entire existence was nothing more than a performance for a critic she had never chosen. That night, as the wind whispered secrets through the cracked window panes, Margaret sat before her desk, surrounded by the eerie glow of her recording devices. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the devices began to record. The familiar, almost comforting sound of static filled the room, only to be pierced by a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. It was as if 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison, were reciting lines from an ancient script. Margaret's pulse quickened as she listened, each word resonating with the sorrow of forgotten memories and the thrill of impending revelation. The recordings continued for several nights, each session revealing a deeper layer of the mystery. In the background of one tape, she heard a soft laugh, a laugh that was both mocking and melancholic. In another, A snippet of a conversation about art, regret, and destiny emerged, spoken in hushed tones that hinted at secrets too dangerous to reveal. The deeper Margaret delved into the recordings, the more she became entangled in a web of intrigue. She began to see patterns, connections between the notes left at her door and the fragmented messages captured on tape. It was as though the very fabric of her life had been woven into a script that she had no control over. As the days melded into nights, the boundary between Margaret's internal fears and the external evidence of the surveillance began to blur. She started to question whether the presence in her home was a deliberate act of cruelty or a tragic manifestation of her own haunted past. In moments of rare vulnerability, she would stand before her mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at her. An actress who had once thrived under the brilliance of stage lights, now reduced to a solitary figure haunted by the gaze of an unseen crowd. Each time, the reflection seemed to hold a secret, an unspoken story of the countless roles she had played, the myriad emotions she had felt, and the inescapable truth that life, in its rawest form, was the ultimate performance. Then, one fateful evening, as Margaret sat in her study reviewing yet another recording, a new sound emerged, a clear, distinct voice speaking directly to her. "You are not alone," it said, gentle yet commanding, echoing in the quiet of the room. The voice was neither male nor female, a disembodied tone that resonated deep within her. It was as if the voice was both an invitation and a warning. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the voice wasn't coming from any device she had set up. It seemed to emanate from the very walls of her home, blending seamlessly with the creaks and groans of the old structure. In that moment, a chilling revelation dawned upon her. The surveillance was not merely an external threat, it was a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of her own mind. The intricate dance of hidden cameras and whispered messages was a carefully orchestrated performance, one that blurred the line between observer and participant. Had she been unwittingly complicit in her own unraveling? Every secret corner of her home, every echo in the hallway, seemed to ask that same unanswerable question. Margaret's investigation reached a crescendo one stormy night when, driven by equal parts fear and defiance, she decided to confront the source of the haunting voice. With a trembling hand, she opened a door that led to the basement, a place she had long avoided since childhood. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended into the cold, damp darkness below. The basement was a repository of memories, old photographs, forgotten costumes from her acting days, and relics of a time when her life had been filled with both light and shadows. Yet, in the far corner of the room, an unfamiliar figure awaited. It wasn't a person, exactly, but rather a cluster of old, discarded television sets, their screens flickering with static. As Margaret approached, the static coalesced into a coherent image, a montage of scenes from her own past performances, intercut with images of her home and the silent watchers that had infiltrated her sanctuary. The voice, now clearer than ever, intoned, "The stage is set. The final act begins now." Margaret's heart pounded in a rhythm that matched the tempest outside. In that surreal moment, she understood the full extent of the intrusion. Every element of her life had been meticulously recorded, every emotion catalogued, not for the sake of entertainment, but as a macabre celebration of her very existence. The revelation was as crushing as it was liberating. Margaret realized that the surveillance had not been an external act of malice, but a manifestation of her own fear of being forgotten, a desperate attempt by an unseen force to immortalize her past. The final twist in this dark narrative was not the act of watching, but the realization that the audience had always been within her. Every role, every tear shed on stage, Every moment of vulnerability had been an invitation to be remembered, to be dissected by the relentless passage of time. And now, in her twilight years, that audience had taken on a life of its own, a silent, unyielding presence that had watched her every moment, waiting for the final, inevitable encore. As the storm subsided and the first light of dawn crept through the basement window, Margaret was left standing in a silence that was both profound and oppressive. The recordings, the hidden cameras, the cryptic notes, all of it had led to this singular moment of self-realization. In confronting the mystery of her unseen audience, she had unearthed a deeper truth about the nature of performance and the haunting persistence of memory. The very act of being observed had transformed her existence into a continuous spectacle, a living archive of her triumphs and regrets. In the days that followed, Margaret made a decision that was as startling as it was inevitable. She began to dismantle the devices, not out of a desire to escape the gaze of the unseen, but to reclaim her narrative. With each removed camera and erased recording, she felt a quiet liberation, a reclaiming of the private spaces that had long been invaded by echoes of the past. Yet, even as the physical evidence was wiped away, the psychological imprint of the experience remained indelible. Every shadow in her home, every quiet whisper in the wind, reminded her that the audience was not a distant specter, but an intrinsic part of who she was. And so, on a crisp morning many weeks later, Margaret sat at her window, watching the world awaken. The sense of being watched had receded, replaced by a contemplative solitude, a quiet acceptance of the roles she had played and the memories that had defined her. In that serene moment, as the gentle light of day embraced her weathered face, she smiled faintly. The final act was over, yet the echoes of that unseen audience lingered like a subtle, haunting refrain in the corridors of her mind. Just as Margaret began to believe that her life might finally return to a semblance of peace, a final note arrived. Slipped under the door of her study was a single sheet of paper, written in the same elegant script as before. The message read, "The performance never truly ends." A chill ran down her spine as she realized that even in her moment of liberation, the indelible mark of that omnipresent audience remained. A reminder that while one chapter may close, the echoes of the past continue to resonate, forever blurring the line between art and life. The revelation left Margaret with a profound, unsettling certainty. She had never been merely an actress on a stage, but a living testament to the complexities of memory and identity. In a world where every glance, every whispered moment, and every hidden recording contributed to the narrative of her existence, she understood that the true horror lay not in the act of being watched, but in the inescapable truth that every life is a performance, and the audience is always watching.